Thank you very much, Tom. And despite the fact there's been no collusion over these talks, I hope that what I'm going to say is really going to follow on quite neatly from Michael, and you'll begin to get the sense of the direction of travel in this debate. The title of my talk was about who's responsible, and it seems to me that there's a particular desire in modern society to identify who's responsible, to hold them to account, and to demand reparations. But in the case of food, I'm really not sure that that's awfully helpful. Quite simply, we all have a responsibility. And when our first reaction is to look at everybody else and blame somebody else, I think that may encourage us to avoid taking action ourselves. But instead, if we can share some kind of common vision about where we want to get to, then perhaps we can begin to start to work together and actually accelerate progress. And that's very much going to be the theme of my talk today. If we want to come together, I think it perhaps helps to remember that the root of the problem of poor diets, and certainly of obesity, really lies in our biology and in our evolution. Food is a basic biological necessity. There are 101 processes in the body which are designed to encourage us to eat, far fewer which tell us to stop, because actually, in evolutionary terms, that didn't make much sense. You should see food and eat it, because it might not be there tomorrow. The problem, of course, is that that leaves us completely ill-equipped to handle the modern food environment, where food's available at every turn, often in very large portions, and as we've heard, at astonishingly cheap prices. And of course, that's confounded by an environment in which we do so very, very little. Now, I suspect that few of us would choose to give up some of the luxuries of 21st century living to go back to the past. And so if we're not going to do that, we have got to find a new way forward. How are we going to cope within the world we find ourselves when we're poorly adapted for that environment? So let's just start with a few really hard facts. And the truth of the matter is that diet is undermining our health. Now, that's not a nutrition evangelist. That's data from something called the Global Burden of Disease Study. And this was put together by economists who looked around the world at different countries, and this is their analysis for the UK. And they estimated the contribution of a whole range of risk factors to ill health, quantified as something called DALYs, disability adjusted life years. Quite simply, what they do is account for how many years are lost through these risk factors, and secondly, how many years are diminished, where quality of life is diminished, so by ill health. So it's a good measure of overall burden of ill health. And diet sits right up there at the top. About 12% of the burden of ill health in this country is attributable to dietary risk factors. And if we add in obesity as well, which is a little bit further down that chart, that's not all food, of course, but there's a significant chunk of it. That adds another 8% or so. So we're perhaps talking about something like a fifth of the avoidable ill health in this country is directly caused by a poor diet. And that should really make us sit up and take notice. If you want to bring it a little bit closer to home, just look at some of these facts. This is for adults in the UK. 1 in 2 have got high cholesterol, 1 in 3 have got high blood pressure, 1 in 4 are clinically obese, 1 in 16 have got diabetes. If we were just to think about the friends and family that are affected by these conditions, which at least in part are driven by a poor diet. Now, we don't see these issues quite so readily in children because high cholesterol, high blood pressure develop over the course of a lifetime. But what we do see is that our children, even for very, very young ages, are overweight. So children starting school, age 4, 1 in 10 of them are already obese. And that doubles by the time they leave primary school, when it's 1 in 5. We are simply failing to protect and nurture our children. And worse still is the fact that this is strongly socially patterned. So children in the poorest areas have twice the risk of being obese, even age 4, than those in the richest areas. That is social disadvantage from an incredibly young age. But what's also striking about this graph here is it's not that there's a little pocket of the most deprived children who are really suffering. This is a completely linear trend. What that says to me is there's something about the environment that children are growing up in which is strongly influencing their chances of being overweight. Because this is based on the area deprivation code. So this is pockets of the country where the environments are not supporting good health. Now, these various health problems, which we can measure very precisely, we can track them over time, I think should tell us very clearly that we've got a problem with our food system. There are supply-side pressures, demand-side pressures, and those are in the context of really insufficient or sometimes completely perverse governance systems. And the consequences are increases in diet-related ill health and, crucially, these growing inequalities. Now, concern about food and health plays itself out in the media on a daily basis. This is not an issue which people are not aware of. We kind of know food is a problem. The challenge we have is that people are incredibly confused, and that in part is because there is no shortage of opinion about what we should eat. The problem is it can be very, very hard for people to separate out opinion from evidence. And that, I think, is one of our real challenges as scientists, is to cut through a lot of often quite emotional opinions about what we should or shouldn't eat with anecdotal case studies, and actually to ask, what does the science tell us? What does the evidence tell us? What does the research, which has looked at hundreds and thousands of people, tell us? Not what does an individual person think, particularly when perhaps health or research may not be their main business. Now, it's not my job or my intention, indeed, today to go through what are the dietary recommendations for good health, but just as a quick reminder, this is what the World Health Organization roughly says we ought to be eating. And these recommendations are mirrored in the UK, North America, Australia, Europe, certainly around the high-income, economically developed countries. And the general consensus is that we, yes, need to eat the right number of calories, we need to be in energy balance, but we need to get fewer of those calories from saturated fat, from sugar, and from salt. And at the same time, we need to be eating more dietary fibre, particularly from fruits and vegetables, but also from grains, cereals, pulses, and so forth. Now, personally, I prefer to talk about foods than nutrients. This is the UK sort of pictorial representation. I have to say it's not my favourite representation, but this is the one which is at the foundation of the UK advice around diet. And what it does at least show is that we should be aiming for a diet which is strongly, heavily based on fruits and vegetables. They take up that big segment of the plate. It also needs to have a good chunk of grains and cereals, particularly the fibre-rich varieties. Such a simple way to improve your diet is to switch to high-fibre, whole-grain varieties of grains and cereals. Then it's got modest amounts of protein, not just from animal sources, but also including plant-based sources, pulses, nuts, and so forth. And a and a small amount of dairy. The media debate tends to focus on, it's all about saturated fat. Oh, no, it's not. It's all about sugar. The truth is that both of these are harmful to our health. I think where the problem comes, particularly with saturated fat, is that the argument often centres on meat and dairy. In fact, the big opportunity for gain is to reduce things like biscuits, cakes, chocolate, confectionery, sugary drinks, and, dare I say it, alcohol. Because if we take those things out of our diet, you remove saturated fat, you remove sugar, you remove calories, you take out a bit of salt as well, and overall we would see really, really marked improvements. That's not to say there isn't work we can do in relation to lower fat meat and dairy, but let's not forget that the big issues in our diet are some of these highly processed, very discretionary items. Now, I'm a scientist, I work in evidence, so let me show you data from 3 trials. And these trials are important because they're the sort of studies that have been done in thousands of people who've been randomly allocated to one or other dietary pattern. So this isn't just your experience or my experience, this is the average of thousands of people. And I've just picked out 3 studies, all of which have taken what I describe as the whole diet approach. So it's not just about changing one nutrient, it's about improving the diet as a whole. The first is the so-called Finnish Diabetes Prevention Programme. So this took a group of people who were overweight and at high risk of diabetes. And they were randomly allocated just to carry on as normal or to have an intensive intervention which helped them to change their lifestyle, to lose weight, eat less fat, sugar, and to be more physically active. And what this graph shows you is the number of people with diabetes. So at the start, 100% of people were actually, it shows people free of diabetes. 100% of people were free of diabetes. And over time, you see the lines coming down as people develop diabetes. After 4 years, what you see is that the risk of diabetes in the intervention group who changed their lifestyle was more than halved. That is the evidence that change works. And it works even for middle-aged folk. So whatever you've been doing till now, there is no time like the present to start making a change. Here's another one. This is what we call secondary prevention. This is people who'd had a heart attack. So at the top, and what we're measuring now is the chances of them having a second event. Here the intervention was very much around a Mediterranean diet. Much less saturated fat, more fruits and vegetables, less meat, more fish. That was the essence of it. Again, what you see is a dramatic reduction in the chances of having a second heart attack in the intervention group. So these are kind of the other way round. So the intervention group up at the top have less likely to have a second heart attack. Here's a third study. This is the so-called DASH diet. This is a much shorter term study because they were simply measuring changes in blood pressure. So many of you may be measuring your blood pressure at home. It's something we can all do to see how we're doing. And what they did here was to give people 3 different kinds of diets, which were high, medium, or low in salt. And to put this in context, 9 grams a day is about what we're eating now, and 4 grams a day is probably what we need. So you can see as salt goes down, blood pressure goes down. But what you also see in this is the effect of the so-called DASH diet. So the DASH diet was high in fruits and vegetables and high in low-fat dairy because we think the calcium and the magnesium in dairy may be quite protective in relation to blood pressure. And so the difference between the 2 lines at every single level of salt intake reflects the benefits of a diet high in fruit and veg and high in low-fat dairy products. And what you can see is that there's a significant benefit in terms of blood pressure. And we'd expect, of course, if you have a lower blood pressure, that would go on to fewer cases of stroke, fewer cases of heart disease. So I hope that just those 3 examples actually do bring it home to you that diet makes a difference and that dietary change could genuinely start improving the health of our nation tomorrow. So, what would be the benefits? Well, colleagues in Oxford have done some calculations just looking at 3 conditions: coronary heart disease, stroke and cancer. They estimate that if we were to meet dietary recommendations, actually we could avoid 33,000 premature deaths every single year. Surely that prize is sufficiently great that we can come together and start thinking about making change happen. And that means we need changes in the way we produce, process, sell, and consume food. It means governments using the power of its own food purchasing to provide a little bit of leadership in the system, and indeed to provide some incentives by procuring food which has been produced to the highest possible nutritional standards. The public purse pays for an enormous amount of food in this country. And if that was only rewarding those producers who are producing the best, highest nutritional quality food, we'd start to see change operating throughout the system. The manufacturers are busy reformulating their brands, and they are beginning to add less fat, less sugar, and less salt. Change is slow, but it is happening, and we need to accelerate the rate of progress. They also know that health is actually quite good for business, and they're innovating with a whole raft of healthy food propositions, whether that's based on specific ingredients or about making a whole raft of healthier options more convenient, or indeed capitalising on this sort of trend which nutritionists hate but marketeers love for superfoods. That's fantastic, I don't knock it, but one of my concerns is that whilst we look to the manufacturers to somehow deliver us this healthier diet, we might lose sight of the inherent nutritional value of core foods. And my worry is that there's nobody who's really standing up for unprocessed foods, the kinds of foods which can be assembled at home and made into healthy and delicious meals. The food system as a whole needs to, from farm to fork, has got to support people to make these healthier food choices. And in primary production, I think two of the issues that we've really got to face up to are about how do we revitalise horticulture, which has declined in an incredibly worrying way in this country. And secondly, I think we also have to reconsider our strategy for livestock production to ensure that it really is a sustainable approach. But what about consumers? What's our responsibility in the food system? And whatever professional role has brought you here today, we are all also consumers and therefore actors in this system. And consumer demand could be one of the most powerful levers in the entire system. But as Tom said at the beginning, for all the talk about healthy eating, for all the sort of aspiration to have a healthier diet, the signs on the ground that people actually are really consciously, consistently taking action towards a healthier diet are somewhat limited. Certainly when I go and do my weekend shopping and I'm standing in the queue, there's not a lot of evidence of healthy eating really playing out in supermarket trolleys. Where it is happening, unfortunately, it's confined to rather small sectors of the population. The problem is that people are ambivalent about change. So in surveys, when we're being our cold, rational, objective selves, we will happily, something like 86% of people say that they're trying to, eat a healthier diet. But the problem is, in everyday practice, old habits die very, very hard. We've all got our own personal food preferences, and they're born out of our whole life of experience and our culture, our heritage. It's not just fussy toddlers who are resistant to change. We kind of, all like what we like. And frankly, we'd like to carry on eating what we like. Change is hard. And that gives a real psychological conflict in people's heads, because when you start hearing health messages, you're not really open and neutral. You're actually adding that evidence into what you already know, into what you already believe. And so you shape what you hear so it best matches your opinions. We've heard lots about this in the context of the election, of people really only hearing the news they want to hear. And that reinforces views rather than leaving people open to change. So what we've increasingly learned is, despite all our efforts at health promotion, because it's largely been based on trying to educate people, give them more knowledge in the belief that that will change their behaviour, in fact, we've often been sadly disappointed. People have not responded quite so well. If we go out on the street today, pretty well everybody I would talk to can tell me very readily that fruit and veg is really, really good and cakes and biscuits are really, really bad. That doesn't have any impact whatsoever on what they would eat if I gave them a plate of biscuits and a plate of bananas. So what we've got to really think about is to get away, I think, from the idea that somehow healthy eating is just down to education. Education's important. I'm not going to stand here from the University of Oxford and tell you education doesn't matter. Education, of course, is important, but it's not enough. It's not enough. I've got tons of knowledge about a healthy diet. But if I sit in a meeting and there's a plate of biscuits on the table, particularly the kind of biscuits that I like, you can be guaranteed that I'll have one with my coffee. But if I'm in my office, I'll happily have a cup of coffee in the morning with no thought of a biscuit because it's not there. The environment shapes what we eat. To some extent, we're incredibly vulnerable. At lunch today, you are going to be the victim of whatever the organisers have chosen for your lunch. And you better hope they've chosen wisely. But we just got to wake up to the fact that when we talk about people making food choices, they're not just simple individual decisions. They are shaped. They're much more unconscious, automatic choices. And that's the reason why so much marketing works. People impulsively buy into things. Even if you go into the supermarket with a list, funny enough, you generally come out with some other stuff as well. So how are we going to change things? Well, in a democracy, that's pretty hard. I don't think I can really imagine that any political party would have got up at this election and offered a return to wartime rationing, even though we were healthier and there were fewer inequalities in our food system than we'd ever seen before. So the question is, how far are we prepared to intervene as a society in the food system in order to drive the kind of changes that we want? And that is a very, very tricky question. It's such a tricky question that, frankly, no political party's gone anywhere near it during this election. Now, fortunately, other people have tried to do that, and I'm actually pleased to say the Nuffield Council produced a fantastic report a few years ago where they tried to set out a framework for policymakers to give them a way of thinking about this. And what you see is the so-called Nuffield ladder of interventions. And what they basically argued is that if you want to intervene, you should always start at the bottom of the ladder. That's the place where you've got the least intrusion into people's lives, where you respect people's autonomy. You should only go up the ladder in a number of circumstances. Firstly, when actions at the bottom have failed, or when the scale of the risk is such that you need to accelerate the pace of change. What they also argued is the higher you go up the ladder, the more evidence you need that actually what you do is going to be effective, because as you go up the ladder, you also start infringing people's personal freedoms and personal autonomy. And so it's a model of what they called libertarian paternalism. I'm not wholly sure I understand what that means, but it's a really good phrase. So at the bottom, you've got the do nothing, you've got the education, what I sometimes call the knowledge-based interventions. And we're doing those in spades. We've been doing them for years and they've not got us very far. So now we're up into the middle. And these are what are often these days called nudge interventions, or choice architectures, the posh phrase. Change the microenvironment so that people, just by default, do something healthier. So this is not about winning hearts and minds, it's just about sheer practicalities. And so you can do things like changing the default. That's the reformulation agenda. Bread's got 50% less salt in it today than it had 10 years ago. And so people buy the same bread, but we've nudged them into actually a healthier diet. We can use incentives in the system. And so that's things like promotions or whatever, to incentivize people to change. Or go up a little bit higher, start using disincentives. What about discouraging people from doing the less healthy option? And then at the very top, you get into what I don't like calling the nanny state, but which is absolutely what the tabloids call it, and it's a lovely bit of alliteration if we have knowledge, nudge, and nanny type interventions. So at the top, you've got those interventions where we start to take more control. And actually, we're beginning to do that. So in the case of children's food, in school, we've become very, very draconian about what you can serve in schools. We've edited choices, so actually we've removed sugary drinks and confectionery. But the question is, how far are we prepared to go in society to use the raft of potential levers at our disposal in order to change the food system? So just really to finish, set against that background, when you look at that picture, whose responsibility is this? Is it the boy? Is it his parents or his teachers? Is it scientists who've left him so confused by all the evidence he doesn't know what to do? What about the company that's selling unlimited soft drinks or buy one, get one free? Is it the local authority who license the catering establishments and who check their kitchens for hygiene but don't actually check them for health? Or have governments simply failed to control the market? Whose responsibility is this? The fact is, we all need to face up to our own responsibilities. And I think what we need to do is to spend a bit less time telling everybody else what they ought to do and actually start digging where we are right now. And when we've all got our own houses in order, whether it's about our own decisions when we go shopping or whether it's about our professional lives, then we can start telling everybody else what perhaps they ought to be doing too. But that would all be much easier if we were working towards some kind of common goal. And that needs leadership and it needs coordination. Today, election day of all days, we might at least agree that we need a collective vision for the future. If it was easy, we'd have done it by now, but it's not. This image is taken from the Cabinet Office report, Food Matters, back in 2008. It was really the last serious effort to embark on a cross-government food strategy. And I think we badly need to take that off the shelf, dust it off, update it for the post-Brexit era, and start working together in earnest. There will need to be trade-offs. There isn't a perfect solution which is going to suit absolutely everybody. But we've got to find a way to create a sustainable food system which works for farmers, conserves environmental resources, and safeguards our health. So, like Tom, I have been astonished how little we've heard about farming during this election campaign. What I notice is we're much more likely to see the NHS who's taking the headlines. And so, as somebody who works, in fact, in the Nuffield Department of Primary Care in Oxford, take it from me that unless we get our food system right, we can be absolutely sure that our NHS will be completely unsustainable. That's why it's so important that we start working together right now, not just talking, but also taking action, because there are things that we could all do tomorrow. Thank you.